What if the one you trust most suddenly scares you? Would you know the difference between a threat and a warning? Why should you care? Because sometimes your greatest danger is what you don't understand. And it might change everything about the way you love and protect your family. It was just after midnight when Max Miller jerked awake, his body stiff with a sudden, primal dread. He wasn't sure what had roused him. Some half-remembered noise in the house, a nightmare dissolving into darkness, or the familiar hum of their old furnace kicking on. He blinked at the ceiling, confused. Then he heard it again, a low, guttural rumble vibrating through the walls, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand up. It was Bear. Max threw off the covers and hurried down the hall, his bare feet silent on the cool hardwood. A pale slice of moonlight spilled into the nursery, illuminating the gentle rise and fall of baby Ethan's chest in the crib. But that peaceful image was shattered by the sight of Bear, his big German shepherd, the loyal friend who'd slept at Max's feet for almost 8 years, now rigid and tense beside the crib, head low, lips curled back to expose gleaming white teeth. The growl was deep, unnatural, nothing like the playful sounds Bear made during tug-of-war or fetch in the backyard. Max froze, heart hammering in his chest. He'd always trusted Bear. From the first day they brought Ethan home, Bear had been the gentle guardian, sniffing the baby's toes, licking his tiny fingers, and dozing protectively by the crib. There'd never been a single moment of fear. Until now. "Bear, what is it, boy?" Max whispered, trying to keep his voice calm, trying not to startle Bear or the sleeping child. The dog didn't look away. His eyes, usually warm and liquid brown, were sharp, fixed on something just past the crib. His whole body trembled with tension, as if ready to spring. The room was so quiet, Max could hear the whirring of the baby monitor, the faint clicking of the clock on the wall. He took a cautious step closer. Bear's growl intensified, and for the first time in his life, Max felt a flicker of fear, real fear, toward his own dog. "Bear, it's okay. Easy, buddy." He held out a hand, palm up, the way the trainer had taught him years ago. Bear's eyes flicked to Max, then back to the crib. Another deep, rumbling sound rolled out of his chest. The baby stirred, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of his blanket, but didn't wake. Max looked around the nursery, searching for anything out of place. A shadow, an open window, maybe a wild animal outside. But everything seemed normal. Just Bear, unmoving and unblinking, locked in some invisible battle Max couldn't understand. A wave of frustration and exhaustion washed over him. Was Bear sick? Was he getting old and confused? Max had read stories online about even the best dogs turning suddenly, unpredictably, when something snapped in their brains. The thought chilled him. He wanted to trust Bear, but instinct screamed at him to get between the dog and his child. He knelt slowly, reaching for Bear's collar, the old blue one with Ethan's name printed next to Bear's own. "Let's go, Bear. Come on. Out." The dog hesitated, then backed away from the crib with one last reluctant glance, growling all the while. Only when they were halfway down the hall did Bear finally break eye contact, tail tucked, body still quivering. Max closed the nursery door, feeling the cold press of doubt settling in his stomach. Bear sat at his feet, head drooping, looking both guilty and anxious. Max scratched behind his ears out of habit, but his hands were shaking. "What's gotten into you?" he murmured. He checked Ethan again. Sound asleep, peaceful, no sign of anything wrong. Maybe Bear had heard a mouse in the walls or sensed a distant thunderstorm. Maybe it was just nerves. Still, as Max led Bear to the kitchen for a drink of water, he couldn't shake the image of those bared teeth, that fierce growl. He remembered the trainer's warning from years ago. Never ignore a dog's instinct, but never let fear rule your heart. Max stayed up for the rest of the night. Bear curled at his feet, both of them wide-eyed and uneasy. Every creak of the house made him jump. He replayed the scene over and over. Bear by the crib, the growl, the look in his eyes. He didn't want to believe his loyal friend could ever mean harm. But what if he was wrong? What if he missed a warning and something happened to Ethan? Could he ever forgive himself? As dawn broke and the house filled with the scent of coffee and baby powder, Max felt more exhausted than ever. He watched Bear pace nervously by the door, casting anxious glances toward the nursery. The question burned in his mind. Was Bear protecting them from something? Or had he become a danger they couldn't see? For the first time, Max wondered if you could ever truly know those you love, or if trust was just another word for faith in the face of fear. The day had barely begun, but everything had changed. Bear was no longer just a protector. He was suddenly, terrifyingly, a stranger in his own home. Bear's anxious, disruptive behavior didn't go away after that first unsettling night. If anything, it got worse. Much worse. Every evening as the shadows deepened and the world outside their windows faded to black, Bear became restless, agitated. He'd start by pacing the hallway, nails clicking on the hardwood in anxious staccato. Sometimes he would sit outside Ethan's nursery, head bowed and ears pricked, listening for sounds no one else could hear. Other times he'd snarl or growl at nothing at all, setting Max's nerves on edge and making Sarah visibly uncomfortable. Sarah's patience thinned with every sleepless night. At first she tried to joke about it. "Maybe he's seeing ghosts," she'd say, forcing a shaky laugh. But the laughter didn't last. When Bear started scratching at Ethan's door during the day, whining and barking at the slightest noise, her worry turned to fear. "Max, this isn't normal," she whispered one afternoon, as Bear paced frantically while Ethan napped, casting anxious glances over his shoulder. "What if he snaps? What if something's wrong with him?" Max wanted to reassure her, but he couldn't find the words. The Bear he'd known, his loyal sidekick through singlehood, marriage, and fatherhood, was slipping away, replaced by a creature Max barely recognized. He tried to keep the peace, making excuses for Bear's behavior, but even he had to admit something was wrong. The tension between Max and Sarah simmered just below the surface, growing thicker each day. They began to argue about the little things, laundry, dishes, nap schedules, but it always circled back to Bear. Sarah wanted him out of the nursery. "It's not safe, Max. I know you love him, but I don't want him near Ethan until we figure out what's going on." Her voice trembled, and her eyes were red from lack of sleep. Max defended Bear at first. "He's never hurt anyone. He's just on edge. Maybe it's the baby crying or the move or something outside." But deep down, doubt crept in. He remembered Bear's growl, the rigid stance, the wild look in his eyes. What if Sarah was right? Bear seemed to sense the growing divide. He became more anxious, following Max everywhere, refusing to settle unless he could see the nursery door. He paced, barked at shadows, and barked at noises only he could hear. Every night, the same ritual played out. Max double-checking the locks, Bear stationed outside Ethan's room, Sarah tossing and turning in bed, her face pinched with worry. Finally, after a particularly tense evening, Bear's growling had woken Ethan twice and Sarah was on the verge of tears. Max did something he'd never imagined he'd have to do. He locked Bear out of the nursery. The moment the door clicked shut, Bear's distress was immediate and heartbreaking. He scratched at the door, whining, his whole body pressed close as if he could will himself inside. Max stood on the other side, guilt gnawing at his chest. He could hear Sarah sigh with relief, and for a brief, bitter moment, he resented her for forcing this decision. That night, the house felt colder, emptier. Bear lay by the door, refusing to leave, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light beneath the threshold. Max lay awake, listening to Bear's soft, mournful whimpers, torn between loyalty to his dog and fear for his son. Sarah, meanwhile, watched Max with suspicion and exhaustion in her eyes. The trust between them was wearing thin. She confided in her mother on the phone, her voice low but urgent. "He just won't listen. He thinks I'm overreacting. But I know something's not right. What if Bear really is dangerous?" The next day, Bear's behavior was even more erratic. He refused to eat breakfast, instead sitting rigidly at the bottom of the stairs, ears pricked and muscles tense. When Ethan laughed from his high chair, Bear barked suddenly, a sharp, warning sound that made everyone jump. Sarah recoiled, clutching Ethan protectively. Max's frustration boiled over. "Enough!" he snapped, voice louder than he intended. Bear shrank back, tail between his legs, as if scolded for something he didn't understand. They tried everything to calm Bear. Extra walks, treats, time in the backyard. Nothing worked. He remained vigilant, obsessed with the nursery. When Sarah tried to comfort him, Bear refused to make eye contact, his entire focus fixed on protecting Ethan, or so it seemed. The argument finally exploded one night after dinner. Sarah, exhausted and shaking, confronted Max in the kitchen. "I can't do this anymore, Max. I can't live like this. Afraid that our own dog might hurt our baby. We have to do something." Her voice broke and she covered her face with her hands. Max was silent for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He looked at Bear, who sat in the hallway, eyes wide and pleading, and then at Sarah, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't know what to say, or how to fix the growing rift between the people and animals he loved most. For the first time in their marriage, Max and Sarah went to bed without speaking. Bear lay outside the nursery, silent but unyielding, a shadowy sentinel in the hallway. Max listened to the ticking of the clock and wondered if trust, once broken, could ever truly be rebuilt, or if fear would win in the end. The fear that grows in the dark, Max realized, isn't always about monsters under the bed. Sometimes it's about the ones you love and the questions you're afraid to ask. And sometimes it's about the answer you don't want to hear. The days bled into nights, and the nights felt endless. Sleep became a luxury neither Max nor Sarah could afford. Every creak in the house sent their hearts racing. Every sound from the nursery forced them out of bed, stumbling toward Ethan's crib in a haze of dread and exhaustion. Bear's anxiety hadn't eased. It only seemed to grow more intense with each passing hour. He barked at empty corners, whined at closed doors, and paced the halls as if searching for something he could never quite find. The Miller home, once a warm, welcoming haven, now felt like a fortress under siege. Sarah reached her breaking point first. "We can't keep living like this," she whispered one morning, clutching her coffee mug with trembling hands. Her eyes were rimmed red from crying and lack of sleep. Max tried to comfort her, but he barely recognized the man in the mirror anymore. Hair rumpled, eyes shadowed, spirit battered by worry. He knew he was failing both his wife and his son, and Bear's constant distress only deepened his guilt. Desperate for answers, they booked the first available appointment at Dr. Karen Lynn's veterinary clinic. Bear, normally calm in the car, whined and pawed at the windows the entire ride, only relaxing when he caught sight of Ethan in the rearview mirror. Dr. Lin ran every test she could think of: blood work, x-rays, neurological exams. But each result came back clear. "Bear is perfectly healthy," she assured them, hands folded neatly on her desk. "Physically, there's nothing wrong." Sarah's shoulders slumped, but Max pushed for more. "What about his behavior? He's never acted like this before, not in 8 years. He's scared of something. He's scaring us." Dr. Lin considered, then suggested they consult a professional dog trainer who specialized in canine intuition, someone who believed dogs could sense things people could not. A day later, they met with Elena Ross, an older woman with sharp blue eyes and the calm presence of someone who'd seen everything. Elena spent an hour observing Bear, watching his posture, his focus, the way he hovered near Ethan's crib, even in an unfamiliar space. She knelt and placed a gentle hand on Bear's back. "He's not aggressive," she said softly. "He's warning you. He's anxious because he senses something you don't. Dogs like Bear are wired to protect their families. Sometimes they know before we do." Sarah shook her head. "Protect us from what? There's nothing there. No drafts, no pests. We checked the house from top to bottom." Elena's answer lingered in the air. "Sometimes what's wrong isn't something you can see." That evening, Max and Sarah sat together in the kitchen, words tumbling over each other in a flood of frustration. "So what now?" Sarah asked, voice raw. "We can't keep living like this. Bear barking at shadows, Ethan waking up every hour. I'm so tired, Max. I'm scared." Max had no answer. He wanted to believe Bear was trying to help, but he felt like he was clinging to memories of a loyal companion who might not exist anymore. Guilt gnawed at him, both for doubting Bear and for risking his son's safety. Bear, once Max's constant shadow, now seemed lost, wandering the house with mournful eyes, laying by the back door as if waiting for someone to let him in on a secret he couldn't share. He would whine when Max left for work, then resume his restless patrol of the nursery, drawn by a sense of duty no one else could understand. Even Sarah, who had once laughed at Bear's quirks and called him her big, furry babysitter, now kept her distance, flinching at every bark. They tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy. Sarah set up a new routine: early walks for Bear, soft music in the nursery, warm milk for Ethan before bed. Max double-checked every lock and window, ran his hands along the baseboards searching for any sign of mold or pests, installed a new baby monitor with night vision and audio sensitivity. Still, Bear's agitation grew. He scratched at the nursery door during the day, barked at unseen threats after midnight, and sometimes sat trembling, staring at Ethan as he slept. The lack of answers drove a wedge between Max and Sarah, each blaming themselves and each other in quiet, bitter silences. Sarah blamed herself for insisting on keeping Bear, for trusting that the dog would never harm Ethan. Max blamed himself for not acting sooner, for not being able to decipher Bear's distress. Their marriage, once solid, was fraying at the edges, held together only by shared worry and fleeting moments of hope. One sleepless night, Max sat alone in the living room, the baby monitor glowing faintly on the coffee table. Bear lay at his feet, eyes half closed but ears alert, every muscle ready to spring into action. Max found himself talking to the dog, voice low and desperate. "Help me out here, Bear. What are you trying to tell me? Are you warning me? Or are you the danger I should be afraid of?" Bear lifted his head and pressed his nose to Max's palm, letting out a soft, plaintive whine. Max's mind raced, replaying every piece of advice he'd gotten. Trust your instincts. Don't ignore the signs. But don't let fear make your choices. Was he making things worse by not trusting Bear? Or was he gambling with his family's safety by holding on to the past? He was torn between a deep, old bond and the urgent need to protect his child. The next morning, Sarah suggested they try one more thing. Let's call in an environmental specialist. Maybe there's something in the house we're missing, something Bear can sense. Max agreed, grasping at any solution that would break the cycle. As they waited for the appointment, Bear resumed his lonely patrol, Ethan's guardian against a threat no one else believed in. For the first time, Max began to wonder if sometimes the people or animals we love most are carrying burdens we'll never fully understand. As Bear circled the nursery once more, Max watched him, torn between hope and fear, and realized that trust is not always about certainty. Sometimes it's about believing even when you have no proof, clinging to the invisible threads that hold families together in the darkest hours. Sleep deprivation changed everything. It seeped into every part of their lives, making ordinary moments feel sharp and dangerous. Max and Sarah began to live in separate orbits, circling each other in their own exhausted routines, never quite touching. At night, when the world outside was silent, and even the city noises seemed to hush, the Miller house pulsed with tension. It felt as if the walls themselves were waiting, watchful, holding their breath along with the family inside. They tried every solution they could think of. Max was determined to find an answer that didn't mean losing Bear. He drove across town to pick up a high-end baby monitor with both audio and video, installing it above Ethan's crib and linking it to their phones. Sarah ordered a set of tiny surveillance cameras, fixing them discreetly in every corner of the nursery and living room. They watched the feeds together, scrolling back through hours of black and white footage, searching for something, anything, that would explain Bear's obsession. Bear, meanwhile, was relentless. He paced outside Ethan's door every night, his claws scratching softly on the floor. Sometimes, in the glow of the cameras, they could see him rise up on his hind legs and press his nose to the door, whimpering low and desperate. During Ethan's naps, Bear lay just outside, ears twitching at every sigh and murmur. At times, he'd let out an anxious bark, making Sarah jump and clutch Ethan to her chest. They brought in environmental specialists, hoping for answers. Two men in crisp blue uniforms spent hours moving through the house, scanning for gas leaks, testing for mold, and checking every electrical socket. They left behind charts and graphs and polite reassurances that everything was fine. "Your house is safe," one said. "If your dog's upset, it's not because of anything here." The lack of answers only made things worse. Sarah became convinced Bear was the danger. She began to tense up every time Bear came near Ethan, her body stiff and cold. She avoided the living room if Bear was there, pulling Ethan into her arms and finding other rooms to sit in. Max noticed the way she looked at Bear now, nervous, wary, the trust between woman and dog broken in a way that felt permanent. The marriage suffered under the weight of all this uncertainty. Max started staying up late, sitting in the kitchen with Bear curled at his feet, the two of them holding their own silent vigils. Sarah slept with one arm draped protectively over Ethan, her body rigid even in dreams. When morning came, she'd shuffle out to the kitchen, eyes hollow, and pass Max without a word. One afternoon, Sarah tried to talk to Max, but the words came out sharp, almost angry. "I can't keep living like this, Max. I can't sleep. I can't think straight. Every time Bear paces or growls, my heart stops." Max tried to soothe her, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "I know you love him, but Ethan is our son. He comes first." Max felt his defenses rising. He wanted to shout that he was just as scared as she was, that he would never risk Ethan's safety. But he didn't. Instead, he stared at Bear, who sat quietly by the door, eyes fixed on the nursery as if waiting for something only he could sense. Days became a blur of repetition. Sarah spent more time out of the house, taking Ethan to the park, to her mother's, anywhere Bear wasn't. Max went through the motions at work, distracted and snappish, replaying camera footage in his head instead of focusing on meetings. Even Bear seemed changed, quieter during the day but more intense at night, as if the darkness brought something out in him. One night, Max watched the nursery camera feed from his phone, fighting sleep. The monitor glowed with soft green light. Bear was there, just outside the crib, lying perfectly still but with his eyes wide open. At one point, Bear rose up, circled the crib, and then sat facing the window, ears pricked. There was nothing to see, just shadows and the faint outline of the maple tree in the yard. Yet Bear watched, unmoving, for nearly an hour. Max couldn't shake the feeling that Bear was trying to tell him something important, something neither he nor Sarah understood. The thought both comforted and terrified him. What if Bear was the only one who could see the real danger? Or what if Bear was the danger? One evening, Sarah's mother came to visit. She took in the exhausted faces, the way Sarah clung to Ethan, the way Bear paced outside the nursery. She sat down with Max after dinner, her voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to trust your instincts. But you also have to trust each other. You and Sarah are on opposite sides, and that's what's tearing you apart, not the dog." Her words echoed in Max's mind as the night deepened. He watched Sarah rock Ethan to sleep, her back turned, her movements careful and tense. He watched Bear patrol the hallway, stopping now and then to listen at the nursery door, always alert. The distance between all of them felt like a chasm, one that grew wider with every silent night. Love, Max realized, was being stretched thinner every day by fear of the unknown. The tension was so thick it pressed on his chest, making every breath feel heavy. He wanted so badly for things to go back to the way they were, to trust Bear completely, to sleep next to his wife without a wall of worry between them, to see his family whole again. But night after night, as Bear kept up his obsessive vigil, as Sarah pulled further away, Max began to wonder if that was even possible. The questions remained. What did Bear know? Was he trying to protect them from something invisible? Or had their loyal companion become something to fear? The answers, for now, remained locked in the silence between them, as love and trust frayed at the edges, and the unknown stretched long and dark before them. The Miller household teetered on the edge, a family stretched thin by sleeplessness and suspicion. The tension that had crept into their lives now set down roots, unspoken, sharp, and ever-present. Every conversation was a balancing act, every glance loaded with accusation or silent pleading. Even the air felt heavier, thick with all the things Max and Sarah wouldn't say aloud. At the center of it all was Bear, the loyal dog who had become both guardian and threat, the wedge slowly splitting their family apart. Sarah's anxiety reached a fever pitch. She jumped at the smallest sounds, held Ethan closer than ever, and grew impatient with every attempt Max made to defend Bear. The smallest details, Bear's paws against the door, his soft whimpers at night, the way his eyes locked onto Ethan's crib, began to feel sinister. Sarah started sleeping with the nursery door locked and a baby monitor clutched in her fist, refusing to leave Ethan alone, even for a moment. One evening, after a day spent on edge, Sarah cornered Max in the kitchen while Bear scratched restlessly at the back door. Her voice trembled, equal parts anger and desperation. "Max, I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this. Afraid, waiting for something bad to happen. We need to rehome Bear, at least until we know for sure what's going on. I know you love him, but Ethan is our baby. He comes first. Please, just listen to me this time." Max's heart twisted. He saw the pain etched into Sarah's face and heard the fear in her voice. But he also saw Bear through the window, sitting in the backyard, drenched in moonlight, ears perked toward the nursery. Memories rushed in. Bear as a clumsy puppy chewing on Max's old sneakers. Bear nosing Max's hand after his dad's funeral. Bear waiting by the door when Max and Sarah brought newborn Ethan home. Every moment felt like a promise that Bear would always protect, never harm. Yet here they were on the verge of tearing their lives apart. Max wanted to argue, to defend Bear, to promise that everything would be fine if they just waited a little longer. But he saw the exhaustion in Sarah's eyes, the thin thread of hope she was clinging to. And for the first time, he wavered. Maybe he was being selfish, blinded by loyalty to a dog he loved more than he could explain. Maybe Bear's presence was a danger. The fear in the house was so strong, Max couldn't tell anymore if it was Bear's fault, or his own for refusing to see what might be true. The breaking point came on a night when the wind howled and rain battered the windows in sheets. Bear's pacing was relentless, a steady drumbeat of claws on wood. Max tried to coax him into settling down, but Bear refused, whining and scratching at the nursery door. The sound frayed Sarah's last nerve. "That's it," she cried, grabbing Bear's leash and storming out onto the porch. "He can sleep outside tonight. I need one night of peace, Max. Just one." Max hesitated, torn. Bear looked up at him, eyes wide and trusting, confused by the sudden banishment. But Sarah's voice left no room for compromise. "If you won't do it, I will." Max watched as she led Bear out into the rain, her jaw clenched. She clipped the leash to a sturdy post on the porch, her hands shaking as she secured the latch. Bear stood perfectly still, fur already spiked with raindrops, his gaze fixed on the door as Sarah closed it behind her. Inside, the house was quieter, but the silence felt unnatural, a kind of emptiness Max had never felt before. The storm outside only magnified the sense of isolation, the steady patter of rain a cruel reminder of Bear huddled on the porch. Max sat at the kitchen table, unable to sleep, listening to the wind and the distant sound of Bear's howling. Each wail cut through him like a knife, dredging up every memory of Bear's loyalty, every time Bear had been the first to sense Max's sorrow or pain. He remembered the look in Bear's eyes as he'd watched over Ethan's crib, the urgency that Max had mistaken for aggression. He wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. It was sometime after midnight when Max heard the crash, a sudden, violent sound that echoed through the quiet house. He jumped up, heart pounding, and raced toward the noise, images of Bear injured or worse flashing through his mind. He rounded the corner and found the living room window shattered, shards of glass glittering on the rug. In the middle of it all stood Bear, fur-soaked, chest heaving, eyes wild with panic and determination. Bear didn't hesitate. He tore down the hallway, claws skittering across the hardwood, and threw himself against the nursery door. Max followed, barely processing the chaos. He was shocked, angry, terrified, all at once. "Bear, stop!" he shouted, but Bear didn't even glance back. He barked, sharp and frantic, pawing at the door until Max finally wrenched it open. Inside the nursery, the air felt wrong, too still, too silent. Bear rushed to the crib, barking with desperate urgency, nudging Max hard in the thigh as if trying to push him forward. Sarah appeared, frantic, Ethan in her arms. "What is it? What's happening?" Her voice cracked, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the baby. In that instant, Max realized Bear's loyalty wasn't a liability. It was a desperate warning, a message he'd failed to understand. Everything they feared, their exhaustion, their arguments, the mounting suspicion, came to a head in those storm-tossed moments. Max stood by the crib, haunted by memories of Bear as a puppy, wondering if all those years of trust were about to be tested in a way he could never have imagined. For the first time, he didn't just see Bear as a dog. He saw him as a guardian, a living warning, a creature who would break through glass and storm to keep his family safe. But the true reason for Bear's panic was only about to be revealed. Lightning cracked across the sky, momentarily illuminating the shattered glass on the living room floor and Bear's drenched, shaking frame. Max hardly had time to process the chaos as Bear shot past him, a blur of wet fur and frenzied purpose, headed straight for Ethan's nursery. Sarah was just a step behind, clutching Ethan, her voice rising in panic. "Max, what's happening? Why did Bear break in?" But Max didn't have answers. Only a deep, bone-chilling fear that whatever Bear was warning them about was happening now. Bear barreled into the nursery, barking, but this was no aggressive, mindless rage. There was intelligence and urgency in every movement. He circled Ethan's crib, barking furiously and pushing at Max with his head, trying to direct his attention. The rain pounded against the window, thunder rattling the glass that remained. Max's heart hammered as he tried to piece it all together, adrenaline clouding his thoughts. He knelt beside Bear, confusion giving way to terror. Ethan's tiny body was limp in Sarah's arms. She shook him gently, voice trembling. "Wake up, baby. Please wake up." Ethan's face, once flushed with the soft pinks of babyhood, was an eerie blue, lips tinged purple. For a split second, time itself seemed to freeze. Max's mind screamed in denial. "No, no, 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 this isn't happening," Bear whined, nosing Ethan's chest, pawing at Sarah as if begging her to act. Max snapped back into focus, a flood of memories from a long-ago infant CPR class flashing in his mind. He pushed past Bear, reaching for his son. "Sarah, put him down, now!" His voice was so sharp, so commanding, that even Sarah obeyed instantly. She laid Ethan gently on the changing table, tears streaming down her face. Bear kept circling, barking, frantic but never aggressive. He nuzzled Ethan's side, nudging him as if willing his tiny heart to beat again. Max started chest compressions, his hands trembling as he counted aloud, his voice cracking with terror. 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe, Ethan, breathe, please. 5, 6, 7. Sarah grabbed her phone with shaking fingers, dialing 911, her words tumbling over each other. "My baby, he's not breathing. Please, please, hurry." Rain hammered the roof. Thunder growled in the distance. In those eternal seconds, nothing existed except the rhythm of Max's desperate compressions and Bear's relentless, hopeful presence. Sarah sobbed, pleading into the phone. "We need help now. He's turning blue." Max's mind raced. Was he doing it right? Was he too late? Bear barked, as if urging him not to stop, but Max fought the urge to collapse, focusing only on his son, on the slight give of Ethan's tiny chest under his palms, on the faintest hope that something would change. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Sarah dropped to her knees beside Max, her hands shaking as she tried to keep Ethan's airway clear, her sobs raw and unfiltered. Bear sat beside her, whining softly, his head pressed close to Ethan, as if trying to transfer his own heartbeat. The storm outside grew louder, lightning making the whole room flicker. It was a scene burned into Max's memory forever. The family huddled in the dim light, united by terror, driven by the purest form of love and fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan's tiny body jerked. A small, almost imperceptible gasp. His chest heaved. He coughed weakly, color slowly returning to his cheeks. Sarah cried out, laughter and sobs mingling. "He's breathing! Oh my God, Max! He's breathing!" Bear barked, tail wagging for the first time in days, licking Ethan's hand as if he too understood the miracle unfolding. Max scooped Ethan into his arms, rocking him gently. The baby whimpered, drawing in shuddering breaths, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, the promise of help finally on its way. Sarah rushed to the front door, flinging it open for the paramedics, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to explain what had happened. Max clung to Ethan, unwilling to let go even as the EMTs surrounded them, working quickly, efficiently, reassuring Sarah as they checked the baby's vital signs. One paramedic, a woman with kind eyes, knelt beside Bear and gave him a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Looks like your dog knew something was wrong before anyone else did," she said softly, smiling at Max. "He's a good boy." Max could barely speak. Relief washed over him in waves, leaving him weak, trembling. Bear pressed against his leg, the two of them united in an unspoken promise. Never again would Max doubt this loyal friend. He looked at Sarah, who nodded through her tears, and they both reached out to Bear, hugging him tightly, wordlessly thanking him for the life he'd just helped save. The night raged on outside, but inside the Millers' home, something had shifted. The storm, which had threatened to tear them apart, had revealed instead the strength of the bonds that held them together. For the first time in weeks, Max saw Bear not as a threat, but as a true guardian, one who would do anything, even break through glass and risk punishment, to protect those he loved. As the paramedics took Ethan and Sarah to the hospital for observation, Max stayed behind with Bear, the adrenaline finally fading. He sat on the nursery floor, Bear's head in his lap, tears streaming down his face. Tears of fear, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. He stroked Bear's wet fur, whispering, "Thank you, old friend. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm so sorry." The dawn was just breaking as Max let Bear curl up beside him, both of them finally at peace. In the growing light, it was clear. The night had changed everything. The truth had come crashing through. And in that moment of crisis, trust was restored. Not just in Bear, but in the unbreakable, wordless bond that only love can create. The hospital room was a quiet sanctuary compared to the storm that had raged through the Miller home the night before. The walls glowed a soft blue in the early morning, and monitors blinked quietly above Ethan's crib-sized bed. Sarah sat in a rocking chair near the window, clutching Ethan's tiny hand, still shaken but unspeakably grateful. Max hadn't left her side since the ambulance ride. Neither of them could sleep. Their eyes kept wandering from Ethan's peaceful, steady breaths to the small white band wrapped around his wrist, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Bear hadn't been allowed in the emergency room, but Max's thoughts kept drifting back to him, curled in the hallway at home, a silent sentinel awaiting news. Max's phone buzzed with messages from neighbors, friends, and family who had seen the ambulance in the early morning. Everyone wanted to know if Ethan was okay, and a few even asked about the commotion and the broken window. Max sent back short, grateful replies, but there was only one message he truly cared about. The one from Sarah, still stunned, whispering, "Bear saved him, Max. He really did." Doctors came and went, running test after test on Ethan, checking his heart, his blood, his breathing. Finally, after what felt like another eternity, A pediatrician with kind eyes sat down across from Max and Sarah. "You both did everything right," she said gently. "And your dog did too. Ethan has a rare form of infant sleep apnea. He's been stopping breathing in his sleep. The episodes can be silent, and if you hadn't acted as quickly as you did—" She paused, her eyes lingering on Ethan's chest as it rose and fell. "It's very likely Bear's behavior woke you up. He may have been sensing changes in Ethan's breathing before you could see or hear anything." Sarah's tears came fast, hot and unguarded. She hugged Ethan to her chest, pressing her cheek to his soft hair. Max felt emotion knotting in his throat, an overwhelming mix of relief, regret, and awe. He remembered all the nights Bear had growled, paced, and barked. Every moment he doubted the dog's instincts, every harsh word, every suspicion. If Bear hadn't smashed that window, if he hadn't insisted on being heard, Ethan might not have survived the night. Word spread quickly, first to the hospital staff and then to the community beyond. Nurses and doctors began stopping by Ethan's room, asking about Bear, shaking their heads in amazement. "He's a real-life lassie," one nurse joked, bringing a smile to Sarah's tired face for the first time in days. Another nurse shared, "You know, there are stories. Dogs who can sense seizures, cancer, even low blood sugar. They know before we do." Max listened, letting the truth of it sink in. Bear had been sounding the alarm all along, trying to save the family he loved. By noon, Ethan was stable, his color returned, his breathing strong and regular under the careful watch of monitors. The doctors explained the treatment plan. Ethan would need a special monitor at home, and they'd be trained on what to do if it happened again. Sarah nodded through her tears, vowing silently never to take another moment for granted. Max texted a quick update to his mother. "Ethan's okay. It was sleep apnea. Bear is a hero." And then slumped into the armchair by the window, drained and grateful. When Max was finally able to slip home that afternoon, Bear was waiting by the door, ears drooped, tail wagging slowly. The living room still bore the evidence of last night's chaos: shattered glass, a wet towel on the floor, muddy paw prints leading from the window to the hallway. Max dropped to his knees, arms open wide. Bear rushed into his embrace, licking Max's face with wild relief. "You did it, buddy," Max whispered, burying his face in Bear's damp fur. "You saved him. I'm so sorry I didn't listen sooner." Neighbors trickled by all day, bringing food, flowers, and wide-eyed questions. Max told the story again and again, how Bear's vigilance had seemed strange, even threatening, until the night it all made sense. People listened, stunned and amazed, shaking their heads in admiration. Even those who had been wary of Bear before, after hearing Sarah and Max's fears, now looked at him differently, with a newfound respect. That evening, when Sarah and Ethan returned home, they found a small crowd waiting at the end of their walkway. There were neighbors, friends, and even a local news reporter holding a camera. Word had traveled. Bear, the dog once accused of being dangerous, was now a local legend. Sarah scooped Ethan into her arms and walked straight to Bear, kneeling beside him so Ethan could rest a hand on Bear's broad head. "Thank you, Bear," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. Bear wagged his tail and nuzzled Ethan, his old gentle self once again. As dusk fell, the Millers sat together in the living room, Bear curled at their feet, Ethan cooing softly. The house, once filled with tension and fear, now pulsed with gratitude. Max glanced at Sarah, who reached across the couch to squeeze his hand, a silent promise that they would move forward together. He looked at Bear, his hero, his friend, his family's true guardian, and realized that miracles come in many forms. Sometimes they come with a wagging tail and a bark you can't ignore. The worst night of their lives had become a turning point. A moment when trust, almost lost, was finally restored. Bear had never stopped protecting them, even when no one else understood the danger. Now the whole world would know what the Miller family had learned the hardest way. Sometimes the greatest heroes are those who can't speak, but whose love is heard louder than any words. It didn't take long for Bear's story to ripple through the neighborhood. The first hint was the line of neighbors outside the Miller's house, some carrying casseroles, others with bouquets or stuffed animals for Ethan, and all of them asking the same thing. Is it true? Did Bear really save the baby? Sarah and Max nodded, their voices catching each time they retold the tale, never quite able to capture the fear and gratitude that had become their constant companions. Within days, Bear's story leaped beyond their block. A local reporter reached out, wanting to feature Bear in a news segment about extraordinary pets. Cameras rolled as Max described Bear's strange behavior and the desperate, stormy night when everything changed. He shared how they doubted Bear, how fear had almost torn their family apart, and how Bear had risked everything, even smashing through a window, to sound the alarm and save Ethan's life. The footage of Bear sitting quietly, his big brown eyes soulful and gentle, played over and over on the evening news, bringing a wave of messages from strangers, some sharing their own stories of loyal pets, others simply sending thanks and admiration. The community responded in ways the Millers never expected. The local animal shelter sent a hero dog medal engraved with Bear's name. The fire department invited Bear and the Millers to a public safety event, where children lined up to pet Bear and parents listened as Max and Sarah shared the warning signs of infant sleep apnea and the importance of trusting a pet's instincts. Bear, wearing his medal and a red bandana, tolerated the attention with dignified patience, pausing only to nuzzle Ethan's stroller and lean into Max's reassuring hand. Sarah watched these moments unfold with a mixture of pride and regret. The shame of her fear lingered, but gratitude outweighed everything else. She recalled the endless nights when Bear's vigilance seemed menacing, the whispered arguments, the loneliness she felt as she tried to protect Ethan in ways she barely understood. Now, every time Bear circled Ethan's crib, Sarah smiled instead of shuddering, offering gentle praise and stroking his fur. She apologized to Bear, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the silent language that exists between people and the animals who love them. Bear seemed to forgive her, responding with the unwavering devotion he'd shown from the beginning. Max, too, felt changed. His faith in Bear had wavered but never disappeared, and the guilt of nearly betraying that bond stuck with him. He found himself watching Bear differently, studying every posture and sound, trying to see the world through his companion's eyes. He began to speak at community gatherings, urging others to listen when their pets behaved oddly, to consider what their animals might be trying to communicate before dismissing them as nuisances or threats. We learned the hard way that sometimes the quietest member of your family is the one who sees danger first, he told the crowd at the firehouse event, Bear sitting patiently at his feet. Trust isn't always easy, but sometimes it's the difference between heartbreak and hope. The change in their home was profound. The anxiety that had crept through their walls was replaced by laughter and relief. Sarah and Max moved through their days lighter, sharing chores and nighttime duties, no longer sleeping in separate rooms or guarding Ethan with suspicion. Bear slept curled up in the nursery, his head on his paws, a silent sentinel who was now celebrated instead of feared. One evening, the neighborhood gathered for a block party in Bear's honor. The Miller's yard was decorated with colorful streamers and a sign that read, "Thank you, Bear." Children drew chalk hearts on the sidewalk, while adults shared stories of the pets that had shaped their lives. Max grilled burgers, and Sarah handed out slices of cake. Ethan perched on her hip and Bear close by, accepting treats and pats from everyone. For the first time in a long time, the Millers felt not just relief, but genuine joy. During the party, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Hollis approached Sarah, tears glistening in her eyes. "You know, I lost my husband a few years back," she said softly, kneeling to scratch Bear behind the ears. "It was our old dog, Charlie, who first realized he'd had a stroke. He barked and barked until I called 911. I never forgot that. Sometimes, animals are angels in disguise." Sarah hugged her, overwhelmed by the realization that she wasn't alone, that every person, every family, had their own stories of trust, doubt, fear, and redemption. Bear's actions had become more than a headline or a neighborhood legend. They were a lesson in humility, forgiveness, and the surprising ways love reveals itself. That night, as the party wound down and the guests drifted home, Max stood in the doorway, Ethan cradled in his arms, Bear pressed close at his feet. He looked at his family, together, whole and forever changed. "We owe everything to him," Max whispered to Sarah, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. "I know. And I'll never forget it." The neighborhood lights faded, but the glow inside the Millers' home remained. Bear, their misunderstood hero, curled beside Ethan's crib, his hero dog Metal glinting softly in the moonlight. The family slept, not just safe, but restored, knowing that their greatest protector had always been by their side, waiting patiently for them to listen. A month had passed since Bear's night of heroism, but the echoes of that stormy evening shaped every moment of the Millers' lives. They weren't just a family recovering from a crisis. They were a family transformed. Ethan was thriving, his breathing carefully monitored by a new medical device, and Bear was never far from his side. But it was the intangible changes that lingered. The way Max and Sarah held each other closer, the soft gratitude in their voices, the quiet presence of Bear, whose calm confidence had become the foundation for their restored trust. The local community center was packed for the monthly family safety seminar. Word had spread about the Millers' story, and parents from across town arrived, eager to learn more about infant sleep apnea, dog intuition, and the bond between humans and their animals. The room hummed with anticipation as Max took the stage, Bear sitting obediently at his side, the hero dog Metal gleaming against his chest. Max looked out over the crowd and took a deep breath. "I want to start by saying that I stand here tonight as a father who almost lost everything," he began, "and as a man who learned the hard way that real trust sometimes means listening to those who can't speak. Not just with your ears, but with your heart." He glanced at Bear, who sat patiently, his eyes meeting Max's in an unspoken connection. For weeks, Bear tried to warn us that something was wrong. He did everything he could to get our attention, pacing, barking, even breaking through a window during a storm. I wish I could say I understood right away, but I didn't. I doubted him. I let fear of the unknown, of making a mistake, cloud my judgment. The crowd listened, riveted, as Max shared the harrowing details. The sleepless nights, the arguments with Sarah, the growing fear that Bear had become a threat. He didn't shy away from his own guilt, describing the ache of watching his wife cry and the pain of locking Bear out of the nursery. I thought I was protecting my family by keeping Bear away, but I was wrong. What I was really doing was closing myself off to the truth. Max explained how Bear's insistence, misread as aggression, was actually an expression of pure, instinctive love. When Bear broke that window, he wasn't being violent. He was doing everything in his power to save our son. If I hadn't listened, if I hadn't let him lead me to Ethan that night, I don't want to think about what might have happened. He looked around the room, seeing parents clutching their children, couples holding hands, and a few wiping away tears. We live in a world that tells us to trust technology, to put our faith in cameras, monitors, and alarms, and those things are important. But sometimes, the greatest warning comes from the ones who are closest to us. Sometimes it's a bark in the night, or a feeling in your gut. Don't ignore it. Trust isn't blind. It's a choice. A choice to believe in those you love, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Sarah joined him on stage, Ethan sleeping peacefully in her arms. She smiled at Max, her gratitude and pride evident. Bear reminded us that courage comes in many forms. He never gave up on us, even when we lost faith in him. And for that, we're forever grateful. As the seminar continued, Max fielded questions from parents and dog owners. They wanted to know how to read their pets' signals, how to balance caution and trust, and how to recognize when a loved one, animal or human, was sounding an alarm. Max answered honestly, drawing from the hardest lessons he'd learned. If your dog is acting out of character, don't just discipline or ignore them. Ask yourself what they're trying to tell you. They see things, sense things that we can't. Don't let your fear block out their warning. He encouraged the crowd to honor all protectors, both voiceless and vocal, who watch over us. Bear saved Ethan's life, but he also saved us from losing faith in each other. He taught us to listen harder, to look deeper, and to trust the instincts that sometimes don't make sense in the moment. As the seminar ended, a young girl approached Bear and hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you for saving the baby." Bear licked her cheek and sat quietly, accepting the affection with the dignity of a true hero. Later that night, as the family walked home beneath the streetlights, Max reflected on how modern technology, cameras, monitors, alarms, had failed to pick up what Bear had known all along. It was Bear's presence, his intuition, and his unwavering devotion that had made the difference. Max resolved to spend his days honoring that gift, listening, watching, and never again taking the silent warnings of love for granted. Back at home, Sarah tucked Ethan into bed, Bear curling up beside the crib. Max stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the scene. He felt the weight of the past months, every sleepless night, every doubt and argument, fade into something brighter. They had nearly lost everything, but what they'd gained was even more precious. A new definition of trust, a deeper understanding of loyalty, and a bond that nothing, not even fear, could break. As Bear lifted his head and met Max's eyes, the message was clear. Sometimes, the truest protectors aren't the loudest or the most obvious. Sometimes, they're the ones we almost ignore, until they save us in ways we never could have imagined. Months passed, but the night Bear broke through the glass and saved Ethan was never far from the Millers' minds. Seasons changed, the trees shedding their summer leaves and blanketing the neighborhood in gold. And life moved on. But it moved differently. Each day was a reminder of the fragile line between loss and gratitude, and the power of listening, even when you don't understand. Bear slept each night beside Ethan's crib, no longer tense or anxious, but peaceful, content to know his family was safe. The nursery had changed, too. A new window, stronger, reinforced, caught the morning sun, its surface etched with a tiny paw print sticker, a silent tribute to the dog who refused to be ignored. The hero dog medal hung above Bear's favorite blanket, a simple reminder of the loyalty that had once been questioned but never lost. Sarah found her own way to give back. She volunteered for a local parent group focused on pediatric health and animal safety, sharing her story with new mothers and fathers, telling them about those restless nights and how close she came to letting fear win. At first, her voice wavered when she recalled the arguments, the doubts, and the tears, but with each telling, she found strength in the lesson Bear had taught them. How love is sometimes loud, sometimes silent, but always meant to protect. Max, too, grew into a different kind of father. The weight of his guilt faded, replaced by a deep humility. He spent weekends organizing community workshops on child safety and pet awareness, inviting veterinarians and pediatricians, but always beginning with his own words. Real courage is listening, especially when you don't understand. Each time he said it, he saw nods of understanding from those who, like him, had once missed the quiet warnings of a loved one. The Millers even took Bear to schools and libraries, letting children read to him and pet his thick fur. Bear wore his guardian angel medal with gentle pride, lying patiently as Ethan toddled by his side, one small hand always reaching for Bear's back. The bond between child and dog was unbreakable. Even after Ethan's episodes of sleep apnea faded, Bear stayed close, somehow knowing that his job, his purpose, wasn't finished just because the emergency had passed. At night, Sarah and Max sometimes sat in the quiet nursery, watching Ethan sleep, Bear dozing in the warm pool of the nightlight. Those moments, so ordinary yet so rare, glowed with meaning. They spoke quietly, never needing many words. "We almost lost everything because we stopped trusting our best friend," Max would say, his voice thick with memory. Sarah would reach over, squeezing his hand. "Never again," she'd promise, and they'd sit together, grateful and whole. The story of Bear's loyalty rippled outward. Other families reached out, some with tales of their own guardian angels, some with apologies for doubting an old pet, and some simply thanking the Millers for reminding them to listen a little more closely. Bear became a symbol of hope at the local shelter. Pictures of him, medal gleaming, hung in the lobby beside adoption flyers, inspiring new families to look at every animal as a potential hero in waiting. But the greatest change was within the Millers themselves. They learned to pay attention, to Bear, to each other, to the smallest signs of worry or wonder. They practiced forgiveness, letting go of the pain that had nearly broken them, and chose instead to celebrate the bond that had held them together through the storm. On a crisp evening as the holidays approached, the Millers welcomed friends and neighbors for a gathering, a new tradition meant to celebrate second chances. Bear was the guest of honor, draped in a festive scarf, his medal shining in the firelight. Ethan, now stronger and always laughing, showed off his best friend to every guest, giggling as Bear followed him from room to room. As the night wound down, Max stood before the small crowd, Bear at his side. The room grew quiet as he spoke. "We learned something important this year, that sometimes the greatest love is shown in ways you never expect. Sometimes it's a bark in the night, or a look you can't quite explain. Sometimes it's being willing to forgive, to start over, and to trust again." He looked down at Bear, his eyes full of gratitude. Never ignore the quiet alarm. The truest guardians sometimes can't speak, but they always protect. Sarah stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. "We are a family because we chose to listen. Bear gave us a second chance, and now we hope our story helps someone else choose trust over fear, hope over doubt." As guests drifted home, Bear curled up in his usual spot beside Ethan's crib. The house was filled with warmth and laughter, echoing with the sounds of forgiveness and faith. In the soft glow of the nightlight, Ethan's breaths came steady and strong. Bear's tail thumped softly against the floor, and Max and Sarah stood in the doorway, arms around each other. They were a family, changed, but not broken. Because when they needed it most, a silent guardian had reminded them that love, in all its forms, is worth fighting for. The final image, Bear, content and trusted again, dozes in the soft light, his metal glinting gently. The family sleeps, safe and together, a living lesson that the truest protectors may not have a voice, but their actions speak louder than words, forever guarding those they love.